The Galactic Dominion had ruled for 500 years. It had crushed rebellions, absorbed weaker civilizations, and left nothing standing that dared to challenge it. Its warships moved through the stars like shadows over water, heavy, quiet, and final. No one fought back. Not anymore. The galaxy had learned that lesson long ago. On the edge of a quiet star system that the Dominion had marked as empty and unimportant, a small Velhari colony ship called the Sarantha's Hope was drifting. It carried 460 passengers, families, elders, and children, who were looking for a new place to settle. They were not soldiers. They were not rebels. They were just people trying to move from one side of the dark to the other. The Dominion boarding party arrived fast. 6 gunships and a destroyer pulled alongside the Sarantha's Hope without warning. Dominion Captain Rilik Oshin had done this kind of work many times before. He walked his crew through the hull breach with the bored efficiency of a man who expected no resistance. The Velhari passengers were herded into the main hold. Children cried. No one spoke above a whisper. Oshin stood near the center of the ship, watching his team catalog names and numbers. The Velhari were a small people, gray-skinned and wide-eyed, with long fingers that trembled when they were afraid. They were afraid now. He did not find that interesting. Fear was normal. It was expected. What happened next was not. His sensor officer called out from the doorway. The man's voice was strange, not panicked, exactly, but stripped of its usual flat tone. He said there was a reading. A mass reading. Something large. Right where the sensor sweep had shown nothing less than 4 seconds ago, Oshin walked to the nearest console and looked at the screen. He stared at it for a long moment. The reading was enormous. Larger than anything his destroyer carried in its threat database. It had simply appeared, no jump signature, no energy trail, no warning at all. Just a vast shape sitting in the dark, close enough that he could have reached it on thrusters in under a minute, deep beneath the Pacific Ocean on a small blue planet that the Dominion had never thought to look at twice. The UES Resolute had been waiting for 11 years. It sat on the ocean floor inside a facility called Site Indigo, sealed off from the world above by water, stone, and silence. No satellite had ever spotted it. No deep-range scanner had ever found it. The Resolute was not on any list, any record, or any map that the public had ever seen. Captain Leon Hargrove stood on the bridge and read the situation report with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man from Savannah, Georgia, steady in the way that quiet rivers are steady, with a face that did not give much away and eyes that took in everything. He had been commanding the Resolute for 6 years and had never fired a single shot in anger. Not yet. His executive officer, Commander Diane Castillo, stood beside him with a cold cup of coffee in her hand. She had a habit of forgetting to drink it while she was thinking. She finished reading the report at the same time he did and said nothing. That was how they worked. They both understood what the report meant before either of them spoke about it. The Resolute was 4.2 kilometers long. Its hull was coated in a material developed after a classified incident in 2301 that bent light, absorbed directed energy, and scattered any scanner signal that touched it. It carried 48 strike craft, 2 rail cannon platforms, and a spinal mass driver that could push a tungsten slug to nearly 0.5% of the speed of light. It had been built for one purpose above all others, to be the answer to a question the galaxy didn't know anyone on Earth was asking. Leon set down the report. He told Diane to plot an intercept course. She nodded and put down her coffee without drinking it. The Resolute's engines came to life for the first time in 11 years, and the great ship rose from the ocean floor like something old and patient finally deciding that it was time. Far away, inside the Sarantha's Hope, Oshin was still staring at his sensor screen when the shape outside the viewport resolved into something he could see with his own eyes. It was not a ship he recognized. It was not a shape he had ever seen in any briefing. It was simply vast, dark and still against the stars, with no running lights and no visible markings. It was the kind of thing that made a man feel, for the first time in a long career, very small. The Resolute dropped out of stealth transit without a sound. One moment the space outside the Sarantha's Hope was empty. The next, it was not. There was no flash of light, no engine flare, no dramatic announcement. The great ship simply appeared, dark and enormous and completely still, as if it had always been there and had simply decided to let itself be seen. Inside the Velhari colony ship, the passengers pressed against the viewports. Some of them had never seen a warship in person before. They had heard stories about Dominion destroyers, cold, angular things with weapons arrays that could split a moon. What floated outside their windows was nothing like that. It was longer than anything they had ever imagined a ship could be. And it was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like a large animal sitting very still. Captain Ashen stared at it for 3 full seconds before he found his voice. He ordered his weapons officer to get a lock. He ordered his pilot to hold position. His hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. He was a man who had faced down small rebellions and frightened colonists, and he had always known where he stood in relation to his opponents. He did not know where he stood now. His weapons officer reported a lock. Ashen gave the order to fire. The destroyer's main battery cut loose, a full broadside of directed energy weapons that could burn through 6 inches of military-grade hull plating in under a second. The beams hit the Resolute's hull and scattered. They did not bounce. They did not reflect. They simply disappeared into the surface of the ship as if the energy had been swallowed whole. Ashen watched it happen and said nothing for a moment. Then he said it again. Fire. His weapons officer looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to stay professional, and said that they had fired, sir. The ship did not appear to notice. The Resolute moved. It did not surge or lurch, it simply closed the distance in a smooth, unhurried arc that took less than 3 seconds. A single rail strike hit the destroyer's drive core with the precision of a surgeon's tool. Not destroying it. Just stopping it. The destroyer went dark and began to drift. The 6 gunships scattered immediately. They were fast, and their pilots were trained, and 3 of them made it to jump distance and disappeared into transit before the Resolute's point defense could reach them. The other 3 did not. Captain Leon Hargrove watched the engagement from the bridge without raising his voice once. When it was over, he told Diane to hold position and prepare a boarding party. Then he turned to Lieutenant Commander Paul Drucker and told him to get his team ready. Paul was a lean man from Portland with a careful face and the habit of checking his sidearm holster twice before going anywhere unfamiliar. He said yes sir and went to get his team. Leon led the boarding party himself. He brought Paul, a 4-person security detail, and Petty Officer Grace Navarro, who was small and quick and spoke 3 languages including a rough version of Standard Velhari that she had learned from recordings during the long months of waiting at Site Indigo. Grace had grown up in Phoenix, and she had a way of being calm in a room full of frightened people that went beyond training. It was just who she was. When they entered the Sarantha's Hope, the Velhari passengers had retreated to the far end of the main hold. They pressed against the wall in a silent group, watching the humans come through the breach. Some of them had lived through Dominion boardings before. They expected uniforms. They expected rifles. They expected to be counted and catalogued. What they got was Grace Navarro, who walked past the security detail, sat cross-legged on the floor in front of a group of Velhari children, and started speaking to them in slow, broken Velhari. She got the pronunciation wrong on the first word and one of the older children almost smiled despite herself. Grace got the pronunciation wrong again on the second word on purpose, and the child actually smiled that time. That was how the fear started to come apart. The Velhari elder, a woman named Sayavoral, watched all of this from across the room. She was old and deliberate in the way that people become after a lifetime of careful decisions. She waited until Leon had spoken to Ashen's restrained crew and until the Dominion soldiers were being secured by the security detail. Then she walked over to Leon and stood in front of him. She looked up at him and asked what the great dark ship was. Leon told her it was called the Resolute, and that it came from a planet called Earth. Saya said that she had never heard of Earth. Leon nodded and said that was exactly the point. Saya studied his face for a long moment, reading it the way a person reads something written in a language they are still learning. Then she nodded slowly, as if she had understood something she hadn't been told. Before she left the ship, transferred safely with the rest of her passengers to a nearby neutral station with the help of a quiet civilian contact named Owen Briggs, who had spent 8 years living in fringe space and knew when not to ask questions. Saya pressed a small carved stone into Grace's hand. It was pale green and smooth, worn round by many years of being held. She said something in her own language. The translator on Grace's wrist rendered it after a pause as, "You were not supposed to be here, and yet." The 3 gunships that had made it out of the Kethra expanse arrived at the nearest Dominion battlegroup within 6 hours. Their pilots were experienced officers who had filed hundreds of incident reports over long careers, and none of them had ever filed one like this. The accounts were confused and contradictory in their details, but they agreed completely on the core of it. A ship had appeared from nowhere. It had shrugged off a full broadside as though the weapons were toys. It had disabled a destroyer in a single strike and left them no room to fight back. Admiral Voss received the recordings in his command chamber and watched them 17 times. He was not a man who panicked. He had earned his rank through careful thinking and slow decisions, and he brought both of those things to bear now. The recordings showed what they showed. He could not make them show something else. He ordered every analyst on his staff to begin working on the sensor data, and then he sat alone with the footage for a while longer and thought. The ship in the recordings had no design lineage he could identify. It matched nothing in the Dominion's combined database of 12,000 registered vessel types across 40 member species. Its hull absorbed energy. It moved without a recognizable drive signature. It had appeared and disappeared without using any jump transit method his people had ever catalogued. Whatever it was, it had not come from anywhere the Dominion knew about. That was, Voss understood, a serious problem. He launched a search fleet. 30 ships under the command of Subcommander Dale Wren, a methodical and ambitious officer with a record of clean, efficient operations. Voss gave Wren one order: find the ship, find where it came from, and return with information. If a prisoner was possible, take one. If not, do not take unnecessary losses. Wren, who had never once come back without results, said he understood and began preparing his fleet. Back on Earth, the incident had already moved up the chain of command before the Resolute had finished its return transit. Captain Leon Hargrove received a tight band call from Admiral George Parlow, who was based in a quiet facility in Colorado Springs and who had the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words with great care. George was 64 years old and had gray hair and a habit of speaking slowly that some people mistook for hesitation. It was not hesitation. It was precision. George told Leon that he had acted without authorization. Leon said that he understood that. George asked him what his reasoning had been. Leon said that a civilian transport was being boarded by a military force and that he had made a call. There was a long silence on the line. George did not sound angry. He sounded like a man doing arithmetic in his head. He told Leon to stay dark, stay mobile, and keep his crew sharp. Then he ended the call. Diane found Leon in the map room about an hour after the call. He was standing in front of a star chart with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at the region of space where the Kale corridor cut through the outer edge of Dominion territory. There was a cold cup of coffee on the table beside him. Diane looked at the coffee, then looked at the star chart, and understood that he had been standing there for a while. She put her own analysis on the table beside the cup. She had spent the last 4 hours working through the likely jump destinations of the 3 gunships that had escaped. She had mapped the battle group positions, estimated the response time, and worked out the most probable route a search fleet would take to cover the region efficiently. Her conclusion was that they would move through the Kale corridor within 6 days, probably in force. Leon studied her work for a while without speaking. Paul came in partway through and leaned against the doorframe, listening. He had a quiet habit of appearing wherever decisions were being made, not because he pushed his way in, but because people tended to think better when they knew someone else was listening carefully. Leon said they were not going to run. They were going to meet the search fleet in the Kale corridor and talk to them. Paul asked what would happen if the talking did not work. Leon said that was why they were not going unarmed. Paul nodded and went to brief his department heads. Diane asked Leon if he thought the Dominion would actually back down from this. Leon was quiet for a moment, still looking at the star chart. He said he did not know. He said that the Dominion had not faced a genuine threat in generations and that organizations like that tended to believe their own strength right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. He said that what they needed to do was give the Dominion a reason to stop and think before it sent another fleet, and another after that, and kept sending them until someone made a mistake that couldn't be taken back. Diane asked how they would do that. Leon picked up his coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. He said that the Resolute was going to have to be very honest about what it was. Not all of it. But enough. Enough to make the Dominion understand that they had pulled on a thread that was connected to something very large and very patient, and that they might want to reconsider before they pulled again. The Resolute moved into the Kale corridor on the 5th day and found a dust nebula at the corridor's edge that was dense enough to mask even its whole signature. It settled inside the nebula and waited. The crew ran quiet drills and ate meals and slept in shifts and waited. Grace kept the carved Velhari stone on the shelf above her bunk. Carlos Reyes, the ship's linguistics officer, sat at his desk in the evenings and worked on his pronunciation of Dravari, the dominant language of the Dominion's ruling species, running through complex diplomatic phrases until they came out clean and correct and human. Subcommander Dale Wren ran a tight fleet. His 30 ships moved through the Kale corridor in a formation he had drilled into his crews over 2 years of joint exercises, a layered spread that covered every sensor angle and left no gap that something large could slip through undetected. He was confident. He had come out here to find one ship, however strange its capabilities, and he had 30 warships to do it with. The mathematics of that were simple. For 4 days, the formation swept the corridor and found nothing. The sensor readings were clean. The star charts showed dust, gas, a few unremarkable stellar bodies, and empty space. Wren walked his bridge with the patience of a man who knew that waiting was part of the work. He reviewed the footage from the Kethra Expanse incident each morning. He studied the shape of the unknown vessel, its movement patterns, the way it had struck the destroyer with one precise hit rather than a broad bombardment. Whoever commanded that ship was not reckless. That meant they were careful. Careful things could be found if you were more careful still. On the 5th day, one of Wren's long-range scouts on the corridor's outer edge reported a gravitational anomaly in the dust nebula to starboard. The reading was faint, barely a whisper against the background noise of the nebula's own density, but it was consistent, and it was moving against the stellar drift. Something very large was holding position inside that cloud. Something that did not want to be seen. Wren called battle stations. His fleet came about in a smooth pivot and formed up facing the nebula. He felt, for the first time in this mission, the particular alertness that came from knowing you were close to something. He ordered a full sensor sweep of the nebula's edge and watched the readings build on his display. The mass shadow was enormous. His sensor officer said, quietly, that it was larger than anything in the Dominion's current inventory. Wren told him to note it in the log and keep scanning. Then a voice came over the Dominion command frequency. It was speaking Dravari, not the simple, clumsy Dravari that translation software produced, but proper Dravari, with the correct tonal registers and the formal diplomatic cadences that indicated a deliberate and considered message. The voice belonged to Carlos Reyes, who was sitting at his linguistic station aboard the Resolute with his hands completely steady and his heart beating slightly faster than normal. He read from the text that Leon had approved word by word, and he got every syllable right. The message said this: "You have come looking for a ship that your commanders do not understand. We are aware of that. We are also aware that the people who sent you do not know what they have asked you to find. This is your opportunity to turn your fleet around and return home. We do not wish to damage your ships or harm your crews. We are asking you, clearly and without any ambiguity, to leave." Wren listened to the message. He played it again. He looked at his weapons officer, who was waiting for an order. He thought about what it meant that this unknown vessel was broadcasting on his own command frequency in a language spoken by fewer than 300 million people across the galaxy. He thought about what kind of ship could do that. Then he told his weapons officer to get a full fleet lock, and he sent back a demand for the unknown vessel to stand down and identify itself for boarding. The Resolute came out of the nebula. Wren had prepared himself to see something large. He had looked at the sensor readings and understood intellectually that the mass shadow was bigger than his flagship. What he had not prepared himself for was the visual reality of it, the way the ship filled the view ahead, dark and without running lights, moving with a slowness that was not hesitation but control. It was the slowness of something that did not need to rush. The engagement that followed lasted 9 minutes. The Resolute absorbed Wren's opening broadside across its forward hull without any visible effect. It struck back with a series of precise rail hits, each one aimed at a drive system or a weapons array, each one landing exactly where it was aimed. It did not fire at hulls. It did not fire at life support. It was taking apart his fleet the way a careful person takes apart a machine, removing the pieces that made it dangerous while leaving the rest intact. 22 of his ships were disabled in the first 6 minutes. 6 more broke formation and ran for jump distance. Ren held with his flagship and 2 escorts, firing everything he had, getting nothing back that mattered. A mass driver round came through his port engine housing at the 8-minute mark and the flagship shuddered and went into a slow spin. The 2 escorts ran. Ren was alone, the weapons fell silent. His ship drifted in a long, slow arc, unable to maneuver or fire. The Resolute moved alongside it and stopped. A channel opened on the command frequency. The voice that spoke this time was not the linguist. It was a different voice, steadier, lower, the voice of someone who had been awake for a long time and was not tired. The voice told Ren that his fleet had fought well and that no one was going to die today. It told him that the Dominion should think carefully about how many more fleets it wanted to send into the dark after a ship that did not appear on any of its charts. It said that the people who built this vessel had been watching the Dominion for a long time, and that this engagement was a message and not a declaration of war, and that the Dominion had a choice to make about how it wanted to respond. Then the channel closed. Ren sat in the silence of his disabled bridge and looked out at the stars and thought about what a choice like that actually meant, and whether anyone back home would understand what he was going to tell them. The Dominion High Command convened an emergency session within 36 hours of the Kale Corridor engagement. The recordings from Ren's fleet had been reviewed by every intelligence branch, every senior admiral, and 3 independent technical analysis teams. The conclusions were the same each time. The vessel in question had no known origin. It had no design lineage in any database. It had appeared, engaged 30 Dominion warships, disabled 28 of them with surgical precision, and then vanished. There was no jump signature on departure. There was no residual energy trail. It was simply there, and then it was not. The High Command debated for 11 hours. Some of the admirals argued for escalation, for sending a larger fleet, 100 ships, 200, enough to overwhelm whatever that vessel was through sheer numbers. Others argued for caution. The voice in the recording had spoken Dravery perfectly. It had known their command frequency. It had known their fleet formation and had responded to it with such precision that it seemed less like a reaction and more like a prepared answer to a question that had already been anticipated. Whatever was behind that ship had been watching the Dominion for a long time. Sending more ships into the dark to find something that could not be found seemed, to the cautious admirals, like exactly the kind of action the unknown voice had warned them against. 3 separate intelligence branches were assigned to find the origin of the vessel. All 3 started with the sensor data from the Kethra Expanse and the Kale Corridor. They looked at the region of space the ship had appeared in. They pulled century-old survey data for every star system within 200 light-years of the incident. They found a handful of unremarkable systems. One of them had a blue-green planet at a stable orbital distance, listed in a survey from 80 years ago as geologically active and uninhabited. The survey team had not lingered. There was nothing there worth noting. None of the intelligence analysts made a connection. The planet remained a footnote in a very old record. The Resolute came home. It descended through the Pacific in silence, running on reduced power, its hull dark against the deep water. The crew did not celebrate. There was no music on the intercom, no announcement over the ship's address system. The people on board were tired in a way that was different from physical exhaustion. It was the tiredness that comes from doing something that cannot be undone, from stepping over a line and knowing the world on the other side of it is different from the one you left. Diane Castillo sat in the officers' mess after the ship had settled back onto the ocean floor and drank a full cup of coffee while it was still hot. It was the first time she had managed that in longer than she could clearly remember. She did not say anything to the 2 junior officers sitting across from her. They did not say anything to her. The 3 of them sat together in the quiet hum of the ship's systems and that was enough. Grace Navarro went to her bunk and pinned the carved Valhari stone to the shelf above it, next to a photograph of her family taken at a beach in Arizona 2 years before she had been assigned to Site Indigo. She lay on her back and looked at the stone for a while. It was pale green and smooth and round. She thought about the Valhari child who had almost smiled at her bad pronunciation, and about Sayavoral's careful face, and about what it meant to be in a place you were not supposed to be and to have helped anyway. Carlos Reyes sat at his desk and began writing a letter home. It was addressed to his mother in Albuquerque. He could not tell her where he was or what he had done, and the letter would sit in a classified hold for several months before the clearance process allowed it to move. He wrote about small things, the quality of the food in the ship's galley, a card game he had won the previous week, a book he had been reading about the history of language. He did not mention the Dravery phrases he had practiced until they were perfect. He did not mention the moment he had opened the channel and spoken into the dark and hoped that his voice would land correctly. He wrote about small things, and it helped. Leon Hargrove wrote his after-action report alone in his quarters. The room was plain and small, with a single photograph of the Georgia coastline above the desk, a wide stretch of pale sand and gray-green water under a heavy sky. He had looked at that photograph on a great many nights over 6 years. He looked at it now while he thought about how to write what had happened in language that was accurate and complete, that he wrote it all. The Valhari ship. The boarding party. His decision to intervene without waiting for authorization. The engagement in the Kale corridor. What he had said to Ren. What he had chosen not to say. He put the reasoning behind each decision in plain, direct sentences and did not soften any of it. When he was done, he read it through once, changed 2 words, and sent it up the chain. Admiral George Parlow received the report in Colorado Springs and read it in full without stopping. He sat with it for a long time after he finished. He thought about the Dominion's search fleets coming back empty. He thought about a planet listed as uninhabited in an 80-year-old survey. He thought about how long that could last, and whether it would last long enough, and what needed to happen in the time they had. He approved the report. He marked the entire engagement classified at the highest level. Then he drafted a single recommendation and forwarded it to the construction board at Site Indigo. The recommendation said that planning should begin immediately on a second vessel. It did not specify a timeline. It did not specify a name. It simply said, begin. Far out in the Kethra expanse, the stars were quiet. No signal moved through that region. No ship passed through it on a logged course. The space where the Sarantha's Hope had drifted was empty now, and would remain empty for a long time. A Dominion rescue ship had recovered Subcommander Wren from his disabled flagship several hours after the engagement ended. He had been debriefed for 11 hours by 2 separate intelligence teams. When they asked him what he believed the unknown vessel was, he thought for a moment before answering. He said he thought it was a warning. They asked him from whom. He said he did not know. He said that was what frightened him most. The debriefing officers wrote that down. They did not have a good answer for it. Nobody did.